Welcome to Community Liberation Podcast, a podcast about applying revolutionary theory to revolutionary practice. My name is Sylvia, and I'm an organizer from Community Liberation Programs, also known as CLP. We're a multinational scientific socialist mass organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we currently run two decolonization programs in Oakland and San Francisco. In Oakland, we have our Oakland Chinatown grocery distribution program, and in the San Francisco Mission District, we have our Youth Street Medic program. We also hold public political education events and classes, like a political prisoner letter writing night and different reading groups. To learn more about our programs, you can follow us on Instagram at Community Liberation Programs, and you can support our Buy Me a Coffee and Give Butter in the show notes. This podcast and other decolonization programs for the people are 100% funded by grassroots donations like yours. So yeah, tonight, it's night when we're recording this. I am joined by two organizers in CLP. I have Geraldo and Kiri here, who have both recently written some Medium articles that you can find linked in the show notes about music. One is titled "The Revolution Will Not Be Streamed on Spotify: The Role of Music in Revolution and Counterrevolution," that Kiri wrote. And Geraldo wrote one very recent event, Neocolonialism at Center Stage, Bad Bunny's Donroe, Propaganda, Blitz. So yeah, Geraldo and Kiri, did you want to introduce yourselves? Just talk about what you do in CLP. How's your night going?
Yeah, I can get it started. Hey y'all, Geraldo. I've been on the podcast for a little bit, so it's nice to be back on. But primarily right now, with CLP, I focus my time and energy on political education, as well as supporting our programs here in the East Bay, um, as well as supporting the political prisoner work as well. So that's also another avenue that I support with. So. Yeah, nice being on. Nice time to talk about the current article. Really interested to get into that as well, since it's so recent and controversial.
Hey everyone, I'm Kiri. Um, yeah, she, they pronouns. Oh yeah, I think, you know, m- most of what I've been focusing on in CLP recently is just a lot of our, coalition work, which encompasses like a lot of different things. And yeah, I think, I've had a pretty good evening so far. Definitely very happy to finally be on the podcast after all this time. And yeah, very excited for tonight.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, so tonight we wanted to start with talking about co-option in history regarding music. A lot of this was covered in the first article that we mentioned, but I think it's important to talk about how things historically develop and how we've gotten to where we are today. So Kiri, did you want to start us off with talking about how you've seen music be co-opted throughout history?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so one of the things I really focus on a lot in my article is, you know, the CIA and how it utilized, music, um, especially in the Cold War, and also just like art kind of more overall. So, for example, they used like abstract expressionist art, kind of against socialist realism in the Soviet Union, to kind of shape perceptions about the US, to kind of make the US look like it's, more free, like more accepting of expressiveness than the Soviet Union. And it would use, fronts like the Congress for Cultural Freedom or other things like that, that were somewhat removed from the CIA in order to hide their involvement. And by hiding their involvement like that, they were able to make even leftists like more willing to have their art used against the Soviet Union. Like the CIA would, for example, go up to, these billionaires or other rich people and ask them to start some sort of, front that seems just kind of philanthropic, at first glance, but is actually doing the CIA's work. And it was like through those fronts that, they're able to, get these leftist art, like kind of like disseminated throughout the world. And like these abstract expressionists you know, likely like weren't really behind regime change in the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, their art was used for those ends. And, to talk specifically about, music in particular, the CIA formed the International Organizations Division, which in particular funded integrated jazz bands, opera, the Boston Symphony. And for the jazz bands in particular, this was again kind of meant to counter certain perceptions about the US. The Soviet Union in particular, critiqued the US a lot for its racism, and rightfully so, for sure. And the US wanted to, counteract these critiques by sending these integrated jazz bands to kind of show that, the US wasn't racist because they have these integrated bands. Um, and I think another, example of how the CIA used music during the Cold War in a really nefarious way, perhaps one of the most nefarious ways, was during Louis Armstrong's tour in Africa. There was, like someone in a political position who was traveling with Armstrong, and it turned out that this person was actually a spy for the CIA and was able to gather critical information during this tour that allowed them to later kill Lumumba. Um, so yeah, there's that's a lot of examples because there was a lot going on, but that's just kind of like I guess somewhat of an overview of how the CIA recognized the power of music and how it used it for counter-revolutionary ends throughout history.
Yeah, and I think another thing kind of currently we kind of saw a little bit of that and you touched on in your article was the role of music that the CIA was using in regime change in Cuba and in Venezuela. I think that is like um at least with the Cuba example, like I know that rap kind of the anti-regime rap or whatever they would want to call it really did spark, the SOS Cuba kind of fraudulent movement a couple years back. And we saw that kind of all throughout Latin America too, that kind of the quote unquote hashtag SOS insert regime we want to overthrow. I mean, it happened in Nicaragua, it happened in Venezuela, and it definitely happened in Cuba. And I think we kind of saw some of the effects of that today, with the current embargo on oil. Kind of the justifications for strangling Cuba are kind of like laid bare, especially with kind of the cultural aspect of U.S. American hegemony against the island. Yeah, I think that's just like one thought I had, and I think you touched on it in your article as well.
Yeah, I think a good movie to watch that Kiri talked about in the article, soundtrack to a coup d'etat, that I watched it like last year, and I feel like it shows like a really good representation of exactly how the CIA used jazz to, um, you know, just to co-opt jazz as a music genre and to, have the killing of Lumumba. It's a really good movie screening. I'm hoping that someday we can screen it as an organization. So if you're like more interested in seeing that, I think there's like ways to watch it. Um, and yeah, I think like music throughout history has, especially throughout like diasporic communities, I think particularly have been very like co-opted and like kind of like representation politics. Like a lot of people from, these countries that are so-called like quote unquote dictatorships or socialist countries will like quote unquote flee and then come and like become really big in the US and like kind of be the spearhead for the United States to try to enact like regime change in that country, to show like that's their spokesperson for that. And I also think with music, like music is a very political part of history, and you can see time and time again different musicians and bands and like where they set their politics, where they're playing concerts like in Tel Aviv, and like which bands have toured there. It's a very political, like culture and politics are very interconnected. And it's important to see these things and see the patterns and to not fall into the liberal mindset of thinking that something is revolutionary when we have seen it before historically pan out to be quite the opposite. Yeah. I don't know if we wanted to talk more on the history or get into the articles. Kiri Geraldo.
No, I don't have much else to add. I mean, I think you bring up a good point, and we'll touch on this in our articles too. Is this like where you perform is political? I was just thinking when you're talking about that was the MDL Beast Fest that happened in Saudi Arabia like 4 months ago, and they had like Halsey and Post Malone and like all these like I guess I wouldn't call them big artists anymore, but bigger artists really selling themselves out to Saudi during the genocide. So I think music's political, and then kind of Kiri you touched on this too in your article. Like, it is kind of trite the term art is political or music's political, but it is true. Like, we're all stamped with the brand of class, and our music is also stamped with that. And we live in a class society. We really can't, you know, escape politics, especially when artists travel to Israel to perform or support Israel or sign anti-BDS petitions or all these types of things. So yeah, I think we'll get into that in the article, but this is some thoughts I was just thinking of when you were talking about like traveling and stuff like that.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, yeah, Kiri, did you want to maybe talk a little bit more about some specific examples that, like more modern examples that we've seen of co-option and counter-revolution in music?
Yeah, no, definitely. Um, yeah, I think one of, the best examples recently, which Geraldo talks about in his article, is, you know, Bad Bunny and his performance at the Super Bowl. Um, and I really want to relate him and that performance to some concepts I talk about in my article. One in particular is the idea of, kind of a cultural elite class and how that's used for, neocolonial capture. So this cultural elite class is, basically like a group of neocolonial agents that do the colonizers' work of co-optation and of depoliticizing the revolution. And there's a couple of things in particular that they do for this. The first one is they'll often kind of make very vague and generally like unthreatening critiques of the US, but they won't actually get at the root issues, or like yeah, get at the root of like what is causing the things that they're critiquing. And they definitely like don't really, chart out a course of action, for people to follow in order to address these root issues. And, I think, Bad Bunny's recent album is a good example of this. You know, in Geraldo's article, he talks about, how the album, does offer critiques of the colonization of Puerto Rico, but doesn't really have any substantial mention of the independence movement, which is a fatal oversight. Because if you don't mention the independence movement, then you're not really getting at, the root issues of what is causing, these problems in Puerto Rico, and it doesn't give you like a real course of action to, fix them. And then, going to the Super Bowl performance specifically, you know, that whole performance was kind of like a promotion of, cultural pride and representation as like the major form of resistance. But again, like this doesn't really get at the root issues of, the oppression of Latin Americans and does not give like a real course of action. This idea of, cultural pride and representation being like one of the ultimate forms of resistance is very much a liberal idea. And, it kind of like directs people's attention away from what they should actually be doing. It directs attention away from collective organizing and nation building and kind of funnels that revolutionary potential into kind of individual choice and representation politics. And I'm sure most of us know about like how there was like that counter performance by Kid Rock. And I think, a lot of people saw watching Bad Bunny's performance as kind of a form of resistance to that and against the right wing. But the problem there is that like what does watching the Super Bowl like actually really materially do for revolution and to fight the right wing? Like resistance is really nothing without any sort of material work, and music can only really do so much without a material base and a connection to the masses. So that's one thing that, this cultural elite class does. Another thing is they kind of, and again, I think Haroldo talks a bit about this in the article, is they sell the idea of the American dream to the colonized in order to make people believe in the system and to identify with the empire and try to assimilate into it, on the off chance that, they can become successful under the system as well. And, this is dangerous because, people want to assimilate into this other colony rather than, recognizing that they're living under conditions of genocide and, preventing them from working towards national liberation, which is what will actually, free them and end their oppression. And in, the Super Bowl performance, they're kind of, Bad Bunny was kind of showing Latin Americans that, they can also make it, that their culture is being recognized by the colonizers, and that's supposed to be an achievement. And, there's like that part in the performance where, he says, God bless America, and has that football with Together We Are America. And, this idea that we are Americans and, assimilating into the empire, is a very dangerous concept, and it's a rejection of your identity as a member of an oppressed nation. And the bottom line is that, anything that promotes assimilation into the US and opposes its balkanization is counter-revolutionary, period. But yeah, that was a lot of talking. I don't know if y'all had any thoughts on anything I said.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was very interesting to, I guess, just like my perspective of watching the Bad Bunny performance and then like seeing the different takes on the internet, even like people like that I in my real life, right? And their views of it. Like it was a general, like among like the general masses, it was a very positive viewing of the performance. Like pretty much everyone at my workplace, were like, oh yeah, it was a great performance. I really liked it. Like it did a lot of things kind of like just didn't get past, or it just like went right past them, right? Like they see this as like a beautiful counter to Donald Trump, right? It's someone showing pride for their nation and for Latin America and for immigrants specifically, and like just showing like the culture behind what it's like to be Latin American. And it was interesting to see a lot of revolutionary or I guess, yeah, revolutionary Instagram like pages or organizations. And like, honestly, it was kind of a hot take to critique the performance, which I didn't think it would be personally. I think that, like, especially as socialist, scientific socialist, Marxist, whatever you want to call yourself, you you should be critiquing and you should be critical of things around you, and no one is above critique, especially someone who is as famous as Bad Bunny. It's not like he's like a regular guy. Like he has a lot of power within like the music industry, within just I guess what's the word, like the cultural sphere of music in the United States, right? And like has a lot of influence on people. So like he has the ability to do better, right? He can actually have a more critical view of the United States. He can actually support an independence movement in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico should not even be a part. it should not be like a colony of the United States. It should be its own country. It is its own country. So yeah, it was just very interesting to, I remember when Geraldo wrote the article, it came out like a few days after the performance, and I was thinking like before we were gonna post it, I was like, we're probably gonna get like a few comments about this. It might be a little bit more of a controversial take, which is like fine because we are putting our politics in command and we are not gonna hold back, right? Like just because the mainstream doesn't view it that way, like that's the whole point of being like in a revolutionary organization, is being able to share your ideas with the masses and like be able to critique and self-critique, obviously. So yeah, I just think that the performance was just an interesting, it was interesting to see the perspectives and the reaction to Bad Bunny's performance, and in the Super Bowl, like of all places where people are like, oh, I can't believe you're critiquing this. It's like it's the Super Bowl, like it is American propaganda, like through and through, right? Like the NFL is not something to praise, right? Like look what they did with Colin Kaepernick. Like I just think it was very interesting to see so many people get so angry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I guess we can go into my article, and this is kind of I guess this is perfect like kind of segue into like current what's in the current zeitgeist. Yeah, so when I guess I can go maybe talk about the history of why I wrote the article. Was I was watching the performance or whatever on like a jury-rigged TikTok live stream because I don't have TV and I'm not gonna watch it on, I'm not gonna purchase television just for me to watch it. Um, and so, I watched it on this kind of like terrible quality, you know, phone video. And there was a lot of thoughts going through my head, as someone who is Latin American, who's Nicaraguan and Mexican, like we constantly hear this like talking point of like, oh, we need to be prideful of our culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the culture that we're prideful of is like, okay, we're close to our family, we're a collective culture. Okay, that's great. Those are all positive things. But then it always goes back to consumerism, which is what, the American capitalist society, wants to push on you, right? That we drink a lot, we eat a lot, we have a lot of children, or we're very sexual, um, and our own people back home are either just the same or easily exploitable, or the eye of Western Euro-American passport bro BS, going and exploiting people in the third world, and especially in Latin America. So, when I was watching that, I got a lot of that as well. And I rewatched it obviously because I'm not going to write an article from a terrible quality live stream. And I rewatched it when it was fully put up on YouTube. And I took notes on it, and a lot of it is really interesting. It does sell that kind of stereotypical, kind of problematic viewpoint of like Latin Americans as, alcoholics, as people that party all the time, that twerk or, show off our body, and, this kind of Latin joy overall, kind of as like this act of liberation or act of freedom or act of like defiance of American society. And you know what? That's totally fine if like I think that's fine to show on the big screen if that's what Bad Bunny wanted to do. Um, but for people to think that it's revolutionary, I think that's something that you need to kind of self-critique on because obviously it's not revolutionary at all. It actually was counter-revolutionary. The whole his whole album, was an anti-colonial kind of sentiment on tourism and the destruction of Puerto Rico. And the livelihoods of his family and of the people that he's supporting, and ultimately became an ad for going to Puerto Rico. And talking to people just like at work and just in my daily life and that kind of stuff, it's like a lot of people are like, oh, I love that performance of Bad Bunny and blah, 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 blah. And, I think I'm going to try to go to Puerto Rico. It's not a country or anything. I don't need a passport. I can just go.
Oh God.
Um, and it's like, isn't the point of the album to critique that like kind of culture vulture like destroying of like the of a destroying a colony of the United States, but therefore it reified the politic of actually no, it is the colony of the United States and it's right for us to exploit it, and maybe it can become a state, the 51st state. And I think we actually kind of went backwards on pushing a more revolutionary politic of no, Puerto Rico is a occupied nation that deserves freedom and that Puerto Ricans have been fighting forever for over 100 years for the liberation of their land. The FALN, the Machaderos, all these like movements existed to wage a protracted people's or wage a revolution to actually free their people. And now to see it on the big screen, basically become an ad, is kind of disgusting. And so, yeah, I wrote the article and, there's even a lot more things in it. Like, as Kiri talked about, like, there's that, like, the side story about him giving the Grammy to the child, Lincoln Fox, I think his name was. And, basically just showing, like, oh, he also can grow up and become an artist and get a Grammy or whatever, bootstrap stuff. And then, getting to the bigger issue, I think was at the end, I'm like, the Lady Gaga thing was like obviously kind of forced and kind of like, whatever. Like it was not whatever, it was kind of emblematic of like a year, kind of the justifications and kind of rebranding of, liberal Zionism in the kind of current day. Um, she's an ardent Zionist. She supports the state of Israel. There's even videos that recently come out of her saying she supports the IDF and they do great work and they should be proud of themselves. She signed anti-BDS, petitions and whatnot, and is not afraid to support the Zionist entity. Put that aside, I think I mean, that's pretty blaringly an issue. But I think, the bigger issue too is bringing it home, this kind of overall like we're all Americans and kind of like co-opting like Jose Marti's like poem, Nuestra America, and basically making it like a thing of like, no, we're all Americans and America, the so-called United States, is leading the third world, is leading, it's protectorate states, this the states below the quote unquote border, toward freedom. That was the symbolism that it was very clear as day. The American flag was leading all of the Latin American flags, in the final act. The football, says we're all Americans or whatever, and God bless America. Like it isn't revolutionary. Like it actually is counter-revolutionary, and it's trying to bring people back into the American culture, American society. Like it's ultimately detrimental because at this present day, we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as American. We should be thinking of ourselves as our oppressed nations that we're a part of. If we're a part of oppressed nations, we're either, we're New African, we're Chicane, or, Latin American, or Nicaraguan, or Mexican, or, whatever, Chinese, you know, oppressed people, right? People from West Asia, Palestinian, Iranian, we're an oppressed nation within the oppressor nation. We should be identifying with that and supporting our people back home to then destroy American imperialism here and from the inside as well. Um, Not trying to re-assimilate everyone into the American ideology. And especially today, like it doesn't make sense to even want to do that, especially after like not just like basically less than a month after the illegal, you know, kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and like basically subjugating Venezuela to like U.S. puppet ship basically, or like a and also like at the time when they were doing this, Trump basically announced the oil embargo that's been wreaking havoc on Cuba. Like it's like really tone deaf, and it's really like an example of like Western chauvinism and Western like American like centric thought that like kind of inundates the American left as well as like the American liberal left, the American, center or whatever. Um, you know, the kind of labor aristocratic, class dynamic of like trying to rehabilitate America into this like country that is worthy of rehabilitating is really sickening. Yeah, and especially after like the delegitimizing of the US, like after the whole ICE, like how ICE basically killed like 8 people, shot multiple people in the street, um, in broad daylight on video, and then killed multiple people in their concentration camps, and they're still doing it to this day. And then coming back and saying we're all Americans and we should be looking towards that. It's pretty blatant, pretty awful. But yeah, that's kind of some of the things that I talked about, and that's some of the reasons for why I wrote the article. We can't just like allow this kind of justification for this politic. It's counter-revolutionary, and it's a disservice to our people. Like we need to be pushing for the ideology against like Americanism of America with 3 Ks. Like I thought we're revolutionaries, not kind of Western chauvinists. That's my big thing with some of the talking points. And I think it really highlighted a big gap in ideology, and a big gap in understanding of the stakes at hand within the settler colony. So yeah, I talked a lot, but yeah, that was some of the thoughts and stuff that kind of influenced why I wrote it. And I still think it still holds up, I'm still standing by the critique. I don't care. Ruthless criticism, all that exists, as Marx said. We can't just like sit around and let stuff happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you read any revolutionary in history, like half of their writing is just critique. um, and there's the reason for it. It's not just like shit talking or something. But yeah, I think you brought up a lot of good points. I think I was gonna say something, but I totally kind of blinking right now. Um, oh yeah, I mean, what I was gonna say is this isn't something that just happen now, like this is a pattern, and it's why it's important to be able to analyze history. And we've seen, throughout history that people will put on big performances like Beyonce Super Bowl performance during Black Lives Matter. She did absolutely nothing for Black people in the United States during that time. Um, and it's a way for um, the ideology that the United States puts upon us, liberalism, to kind of keep us in check, keeps people to stop not question things, right? They don't want us to be questioning these things. They don't want us to be critiquing. And it's also a way for like honestly like the Democratic Party to be like, oh yeah, like we are not Donald Trump. He's doing all these horrible things right now. Like I listened to Bad Bunny, or I think like there was like a article about like who like Barack Obama listens to, and like he loved like Kendrick Lamar's. Um, and like it this will happen. You're going to see this, especially the next election cycle. Like um people are going to be justifying that they are good people because they listen to these artists that critique I guess like Donald Trump, or critique the far right, or critique ICE. they'll definitely be used, and artists that maybe have more revolutionary tendencies and have more revolutionary music will be used and co-opted by the Democratic Party. um yeah, thank you so much for writing that article, Geraldo, and like Kiri for starting us off talking about it. We had a few other kind of examples. I know, Kiri, you wrote about a few in your article. I don't know if you wanted to discuss those as well.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so speaking of, Kendrick Lamar and Beyonce, I do talk about them a bit in my article. So I guess, starting with Kendrick Lamar, he, kind of painted himself or cultivated an image as a black quote unquote revolutionary. You know, a lot of his music has kind of levied critiques at the US and tried to bring light to the oppression that Africans face. And he defended Colin Kaepernick. He's made like kind of vague references to Pan-Africanism in some of his performances, and one of his songs kind of became an anthem for the Black Lives Matter movement. And he performed that at the Grammys, which is, well, already kind of ironic. But like even just like in these examples, like you can kind of see like the contradictions between, this image as a black revolutionary and, what he's actually doing. Like I said, he, performed at the Grammys and he also performed at, the Super Bowl, despite defending Colin Kaepernick. And he's also, made reactionary comments about Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. And, he talks about Pan-Africanism, and about the oppression that Africans face, but hasn't really committed any sort of concrete support for the Pan-African movement or for the Republic of New Africa. Um, yeah, and so there's like a real contradiction between like this image that he cultivates, and what he actually like does for the movement. And it's like one of the most glaring examples that I give in the article is how during the performance he calls Drake a colonizer, despite the fact that, Kendrick himself like was doing nothing about the actual colonization and genocide being carried out in Gaza. And meanwhile, one of his halftime performers, like was like took a risk to speak out about that despite having like way more to lose than Kendrick himself. Um, yeah, and then moving on to Beyonce, I think you talked a little bit about this already, but you know, during her Super Bowl performance, she appropriated the aesthetic of the Black Panther Party, um, despite not really doing anything, for like materially for New Africans. And, perhaps even worse, like more recent actions have, shown how kind of revolutionary she actually is. She recently like wore a short, depicting the Buffalo Soldiers, which, was a regiment that took part in, the genocide and subjugation of indigenous people. And this wasn't just like a mistake. Her recent album, Act Two, Cowboy Carter, is kind of seen as, sort of a reclamation of American identity for the Black community. But, kind of like what we've been saying, America and American history, is a history of genocide and a history of enslavement and settler colonialism. And, if you're trying to reclaim this history for Black people, you're just claiming that Black people can assimilate into the same settler colony that has exploited and enslaved and committed genocide against them. So, neocolonial agents like Beyonce, encourage, Black people to embrace a settler identity and, and its privileges, at the expense of colonized people, both within the so-called US and abroad. So yeah, it's just kind of like another instance of an artist, like cosplaying as a revolutionary for their own personal gain while like doing nothing material to actually advance the movement.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about the Buffalo Soldier thing. I guess it wasn't just a thing, it was pretty big. Like for wearing that shirt. And yeah, I just actually ran across it because people were talking about Beyonce recently did this thing on social media calling like it wasn't even like calling for support of Puerto Rico. She just like it's a picture of her like awkwardly sitting there with a fork and a knife in her hand in front of a hamburger, whatever. Um, and then next to her on her right is an American flag and the Puerto Rican flag. Take that as what you may. You know, and they're at the same height, so maybe whatever that means, right? Um, but people were critiquing her because of the Buffalo Soldier t-shirt she wore, and on that t-shirt there was a specific quote that says, "Their antagonists." The Buffalo Soldiers' antagonists were the enemies of peace, order, and settlement. Warring Indians, bandits, cattle thieves, murderous gunmen, bootleggers, trespassers, and Mexican revolutionaries. All these they met many times and with success, regardless of extreme climate and terrain. Blah blah blah. Basically, they destroyed them. So like kind of like, clear as mud, or not even clear as mud, clear as day. The kind of settler ideology is like rehabilitated to justify like kind of what you're talking about, Kiri, in terms of like a reclamation of country music or reclamation of the Western mythos of manifest destiny. So yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Okay, I just looked up the photo shoot that you're talking about with the hamburger. Sorry, I don't know if this is like super important, but this is a wild photo shoot. Yeah, I encourage people to look at this photo. And you know, then you can
It'll be our
critique our
thumbnail.
article.
It'll be our thumbnail for the podcast.
Yeah, maybe.
No, no, no. That we'll have another podcast on hamburgers, so that's another thing. So
Yeah,
on the hamburger ideology.
yeah. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think we've talked, a bit about, our current cultural examples of co-option within the music industry. Um, and, I think this has been like a big critique session. And maybe, we'll go into a little bit more, but I think at the end we'll, give some more positive light on music and how it can be used in a revolutionary way. But I think the next topic we wanted to talk about is kind of the discourse around using alternatives to Spotify. I think this is just kind of like a thing we've noticed throughout, honestly, I think since probably 2020, there's been a lot of discussion on using alternatives for things. Don't use Amazon, don't use Spotify, don't use Instagram, use these other platforms. And we are a organization that's on Instagram. We are on Twitter or X or whatever. We are on Spotify. this podcast is published on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. Yeah, I think this is a discussion that we can talk about, and like how people try to promote like alternatives, and like how these alternatives pan out. Like, are they really alternatives? Are they easy to use for people? Like, is there a preferred alternative? Like, is there something that we can actually switch over to in this moment in time? And your opinions on that, Geraldo or Kiri?
Yeah, I can get it started. Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. I think in 2020, I don't remember when Elon Musk bought Twitter. Maybe that was 2020, maybe 2021. No,
Yeah, I think it was like a little bit later than 2020. I
so maybe
feel like it's kind of
2022.
recent.
Uh, yeah, it doesn't matter. Anyhow, he bought Twitter, changes X, but
2022.
2022,
Sorry.
and right when he bought it, that was kind of we saw a kind of a new resurgence of like this kind of concept that kind of the mechanization of co-option, like um within kind of the liberal Democrat sphere. So when he bought Twitter, a lot of people were jumping ship because they're like, oh, a fascist bought Twitter, therefore Twitter is going to be unusable and surveilling us or whatever, that kind of politic. And not even to say the fact that like Jack Dorsey, the guy that previously owned Twitter, was any better. Like he was also like a fascist too. Like it wasn't any better under him. I guess it was kind of a little bit better because the algorithm was better, but that's whatever. Um, so Elon buys it, it gets rampant with a bunch of bots and whatnot. He fires a bunch of people and kind of turns it into kind of a right-wing talking, you know, application. And so people were like, "Oh my God, like we need alternatives." And so the alternatives that they went towards were Blue Sky. And so Blue Sky is like the alternative to Twitter. And recently, this came out like Blue Sky has been banning any Palestinian that uses the application that has a IP address in Palestine in Gaza specifically. So Blue Sky now, like, people were going to Blue Sky for a lot of reasons. Like one, the Elon Musk stuff, but two, they were going for it because of censorship against Palestinians. And then they go to Blue Sky and they're censoring Palestinians and doing all these horrible things. But like if we kind of looked at the who made Blue Sky was like made by like a Zionist. I think some of the people on their team were like Israeli, and so like there's no like escaping the fact that like there is going to be like censorship of like anything countering like the current mode or method of politic. Um, And I think another thing we saw recently was with upscroll. There was a big push to go to upscroll because of Instagram. Instagram has been very, very censoring and like very reactionary, and I definitely like totally agree with that. Like CLP has been censored and all this type of stuff, and we have to walk a tight line to keep our stuff afloat on that app. Um, But Upscroll, like there was a big push, and I joined Upscroll because the social investigation, and then it was also during when I forgot his name, Ellison bought TikTok, the Zionist is Zionist multi-billionaire or whatever bought TikTok in the TikTok deal. Yeah, I've been to Upscroll, and it's basically kind of dead now, and it's mostly like a lot of bots, a lot of really isn't a lot of engagement anymore. It's kind of like the momentum died, and it doesn't really seem like an alternative to Instagram or TikTok. So yeah, I think as a revolutionary organization, we really can't cede ground to like the right or like the liberal left, or like liberals in general. Like we have to this is our line, is that we do have to like struggle on those terrains as well, like despite the fact that it is going to be difficult and the odds are against us. But it does reach a lot more people than it would if we were on like a Blue Sky or like on a up scroll or something. Like we do have to struggle on that terrain because that's where most people are. And unless something changes, I don't see people getting off of these applications, the kind of legacy applications like TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. So yeah, I see like the push for alternatives is also a push for co-option and in control of specific thoughts and ideologies. So yeah, just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also consider like some of the alternatives. Like I think like when we were thinking about making a podcast and like what we were going to put it on, like most people I would talk to were like, oh, like I would listen to it on Apple Podcasts, or if they don't have an iPhone or something like Spotify, like most people have Spotify. And this isn't like to say like, oh, Spotify is great and that's why we have it on Spotify. Like Spotify is like notoriously known to, not pay artists, like they pay them shit basically for how many streams they get. They advertise ice ads, like they're not above critique. Obviously, Spotify's pretty horrible. But it is what most people have and most people pay for. It's like relatively affordable. It has like kind of a bad shuffle now, but like most people have been using it for years and like it's kind of hard to get off. And there are like alternative streaming services, but I think like if we were to go on an alternative streaming service, we'd probably reach like half or a quarter the amount of people. And like the point of a revolutionary organization, it's like not like us to like gain followers and get all this clout. Like that's not why we want people following us. We want people following us so they can learn something, so they can apply it to their communities, so they can volunteer and like actually like build more political consciousness and become better people, right? So we have to kind of work with what we have right now in this phase of the revolution, and like the first phase of like kind of building the class consciousness and building people together is like we have to kind of work like with what we got. And I was gonna say something else. I keep blinking. I get one thing on my head and then I can't remember what I was gonna say. But yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for what I got. But yeah, like I think it's important to critique obviously all these like multi-billionaire corporations that kind of control the internet. And like the individual choice of it all. A lot of the critique is kind of just making people feel bad for using certain things that are accessible to them. And it's not really actually critiquing the system and like putting an end to it. And we've seen this, like, this is another historical thing that we've seen throughout the years. Like, I think one of my first like politicalization and like realization was like an individual choice thing. Like I have a background in like natural history or like ecology, and when I was in college, like I think a lot of the environmental movement also like has a lot of individual choice behind it, like don't use plastic bags, like conserve like water, like all just to like that one person rather than like the system. And like that's a lot of the things that I think the system will kind of propaganda will be put on us, and it'll be like more of a mainstream thing. So like we when critiquing these certain companies, like you shouldn't like make like the masses feel bad about using them. Like that's not the message you want to be getting across. And like I think we should strive to build an alternative to what is already in place, an alternative to Instagram and that and Twitter and Spotify. But until that is there and there's a viable alternative for us, like the only way to reach people is through the resources that we have. Yeah. I don't know, Kiri, if you wanted to add anything to that, or we can move on to kind of like our last topic we wanted to talk about.
I don't have too much to add. I think you kind of like took a lot of the words out of my mouth, to be honest. I really like your point uh, about like individual choice and stuff. Yeah, I think that's very much a liberal perspective that kind of, channels people's energy into individual acts rather than collective organizing. And yeah, I was actually thinking it was very similar to like the whole climate change discourse as well. There was like, I guess maybe a slight caveat I wanted to make, which you kind of alluded to, which is that like it's not like we're totally against like alternatives or anything like that. Like they certainly like may be necessary. And like when it comes to like revolutionary art in particular, like it may become necessary because mainstream platforms may reject them in one way or another. Like maybe the algorithms won't promote them, or maybe like we don't have money for like ads or promotion, or like record labels like won't like reach out to us or anything like that. There's like a lot of, you know, it's like an uphill battle for revolutionary art. And so like out of necessity, like you might have to find like other channels if like mainstream channels like aren't reaching enough people. Um And I think alternatives are also important because, as I talk about in my article, it's really important for revolutionary artists to have some sort of a connection to the community, in particular to make sure their music isn't co-opted. And so, looking towards alternatives can help with that. Maybe, one way you can try to disseminate your work is, performing in the community. Like maybe there's like a revolutionary organization putting on some sort of a community event, like for their decolonization programs, and you perform at that. Like that's a way to like, promote your revolutionary art as well as to connect with the masses and help with nation building. Um, so yeah, like this, these kinds of alternatives like aren't, it's not about like putting the blame or focus on individuals. It's more about like a necessity for disseminating your work and connecting with the masses. And I kind of like what you said about, we should build alternatives eventually. And I think that's another thing that's missing from this whole boycott discourse is like it's, telling you like what not to do, but like it's not telling you like what to do, I guess. Like it's not really telling you to build anything. And like I think it's really important for us to build cultural infrastructure as like part of revolutionary infrastructure and nation building. And yeah, the boycotts just kind of like don't really quite get at that, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. It's really important to be a part of your community, and like that's one way you can kind of bypass the censorship, I think, of like these big companies is being like actually out there, like touching grass, like being with the people, putting on shows. Like if you're an artist, like performing at more like DIY venues and like rejecting, I forgot what it was, but there was like a big poll. Geraldo, you probably know what I'm talking about.
Big the what?
The during like 2020.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think I know what you're referencing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, this kind of is a perfect example. So like folks who may not know, there's this trio, rap trio, Injury Reserve, and one of their members, Groggs, he passed away, and then they became by Storm. And their recent album, oh my God, blanking on it. It's a really good album. I would recommend listening to it, by Storm, and it's called, it's like, uh, I'm not gonna butcher it. My Ghosts Go Ghost. It's a very good album. I'd highly recommend it. It's very short too. But one of the albums on it is called, one of the songs on the album is called In My Town, which is like a critique of, um, an experience that they had, touring, post the shutdown. Um, so a lot of artists, they had to go on tour to, to one, recoup funds, but also get people re-energized in their music. And one thing that was going on in 2023 was, Live Nation did a promotion where, um, artists could partner with them with their On the Road Again partnership. And the On the Road Again partnership was like almost too good to be true type of a partnership. So basically, you would get a $1,200 Shell gift card for gasoline to tour. You would get like a stipend, I think, on top of that. And then you would get 100% of all merch sales, which is like wild. That's like wild for like any artist to be able to get, especially if you're able to work with Live Nation, which is a huge, huge venue, and ticketing organization. And but the caveat was you can't go to any of the smaller venues. You have to go to specific Live Nation venues. And so, the song In My Town was like kind of like, oh, we're not going to do that, but wouldn't it be good if we did? And kind of that dichotomy of like being an artist, like with principles and being like, maybe we're not going to do that. We're actually going to do what we want to do and like do the shit like all our own. Um, and um, and it's a perfect example of kind of like, um, that this like way to get artists to go and tour was also one of the ways to kind of destroyed their competition. Like a bunch of venues in San Francisco went under, and especially in Oakland as well. Slim's went under, Starline here in Oakland went under, and a couple other ones too. I think Rickshaw Stop went under for a little bit, and they came back, but they all felt the brunt of not only the pandemic but also this like Live Nation, basically too good to be true platform partnership, and I think this brings a good point. Is like if you're an artist, you have to have principles. Like you need to support not just like you know your music and whatnot and your art, like that's great, but you also need to support with like physically support it through like supporting smaller venues, some more supporting organizations on the ground, supporting, individuals, in the community and being connected to your community. There are very few artists that are that are like that. The only ones I can think of off the top of my head are like No Name with No Name Book Club and her library that supports like hundreds, probably thousands of political prisoners and prisoners in general all throughout the country with free books. Um, there's other artists, Injury Reserved by Storm was one of them as well. They did a lot of great work, supporting their community and doing the stuff kind of DIY. Another one is Show Me the Body through Corpus. They have their own organization and they've done reading groups and they support all types of,
They do like
organizations and whatnot.
self-defense classes too.
Yeah, it's like they do a lot of stuff to support their community. They're not just like making music, right?
Mhm.
Um, Yeah, this is like an example of what revolutionary artists can be. Another one's like Mike. Mike does great work too. He's connected to his community and he highlights his community in his music and he did like, I don't even remember how many shows he did as for his last album, but he did a bunch of work and he wasn't afraid to say Free Palestine, and all this stuff. He didn't care. And he was connected to his community and supporting the work that was needed. And we need more of that. We need artists that actually have a following that actually support the people on the ground. Um, so yeah, I think Kiri bring up a lot of good points, and I think that the Live Nation example was a good one. Thank you for bringing that up. But
Yeah,
it
I
came
just
up.
totally forgot the name of Live Nation. I'm like, I'm not gonna like butcher this right now.
I was thinking about that earlier, but thank you for bringing it back. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this was a really good segue. You already kind of segued into our more positive light, like we've been talking a lot of discourse tonight on co-option and like critiquing it, but I think it's important to show that like not everyone is bad. There are good people, right? There are people doing things. We have examples. Yeah, Kiri, I don't know if you had any other examples too on like, or just like on like what it means to be a revolutionary artist and like how to become one.
Yeah, definitely got a lot to say here. Yeah, I'll start out with how, yeah, art can be used for a revolution and what it means to be a revolutionary artist. So the main things I talk about in my article in terms of how to use art for revolution is first you have to, expose contradictions, in society through your music. As Amiri Baraka says, you have to make war with your music. I mean, I have to like show the contradictions of capitalism and imperialism. You have to be rejecting the American identity and embracing the struggle for national liberation. In addition to this, you also need to make sure that you're envisioning the future. And I think this point in particular is one that's missing in a lot of music. There's like a lot of music that, critiques things, but doesn't say like what we should do to fix things and doesn't, show us that like we can actually do something. The ruling class really thrives like when we're paralyzed by doomerism and inaction. So like it's really important that we have music that goes, beyond this and shows us that, there is hope. We can have revolutionary optimism. We can change things. And the third thing that I talk about is it's really important to use music to make revolutionary culture an integral part of life, a way of life. And we have to make revolution irresistible. And, one example I give is, we can learn from the oppressor, themselves. You know, we have a lot of capitalist propaganda permeating our lives. And one in particular is like ads. Like, I mean, ads are pretty much like everywhere, in our lives, unfortunately. And they manipulate us into, buying things and doing things to pacify us and distract us from our own suffering. So, like, imagine if instead of having all these ads, like, we had revolutionary art be just as ingrained into everyday life. I mean, it could be extremely powerful and make revolution appealing in the same way as these capitalist products are. And when it comes to, being a revolutionary artist, like we've been talking about a lot today, it's really important that you're not just making music in a little bubble. You have to be out there on the streets, like actually organizing. And you need to have like, a material base for your music, and you need to be utilizing scientific socialism like in your music creation. This means, conducting social investigation to understand the community and the issues they're facing and who your audience even is. And then you have to, analyze this information and identify, the contradictions and the principal contradiction and the revolutionary forces and like how, your music can, contribute to resolving the principal contradiction. And then, you need going back to the material base thing, it's really important that, your music is talking about exposing contradictions and about envisioning the future, but you also have to be doing that on the ground. Like you have to be, doing things on the ground that are exposing these contradictions, or you like have to actually be doing things on the ground that are building the future that you're talking about. So yeah, I think those are all like really, important things for the revolutionary artist to be doing. And in terms of like examples, so we already mentioned No Name. I think that's a really good example. Another artist whom I looked up to a lot is Tupac. Um, and in particular, like his code of thug life. I think this is something that I feel is a bit underappreciated. This code was like essentially like trying to organize gangs, with a code of conduct, basically like, no drugs, no violence in the community, making sure to treat women well, etc. Um, and I think it's really important for us to be organizing the lumpen proletariat like this, because they're a part of the revolutionary forces, but they can kind of go either way. Like they could either, you know, be a really strong revolutionary force, or they could be a really strong counter-revolutionary force if we don't organize them. And, for better or worse, they're often a pretty active presence in the community, and they can actually be pretty organized, like already. So, like, I think he really had like a clear analysis, to recognize like the importance of organizing the lumpen proletariat like this, in addition to making his music. Another example, perhaps like not quite as big as some of the other artists we talked about are, we recently, like in January, had a Cuba Report Back event where we were, trying to counter a lot of the, imperialist propaganda about Cuba and try to, raise material aid. And we had some cultural performances, during this event, including, performances from organizers with Neighbor Program, who we partnered with to put on this event. And there are other artists as well, like Hey Levi and Equipto. And I think, this is like the perfect example of like how you can use, revolutionary music, like to actually like work towards revolution in a material way. But yeah, those are pretty much all my thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. We also, a good way for artists, I think Geraldo and Kiri also talked about this was, we had a fundraiser show, and to, perform for an organization to fundraise for them, to put, money back into the community basically. So, I just wanted to thank the artists that performed at our fundraiser show at Eli's. We had Same Spell, King Isis, Big Dog Mastiff, and Superco's perform for us. And also just thank Eli's for being like a really sick venue. They're a historic venue in Oakland, been around for super long time. And they were a threat of being closed by the city of Oakland too. So yeah, it's just important to support, these local venues that get back to the community and do fundraiser shows for a bunch of different organizations. And that's like a pretty easy way, I think, as like an artist, especially if you have a big following, to get the word out about what's going on and how people can support. But yeah, Geraldo, I don't know if you wanted to add any final thoughts. I know you unmuted for a second.
Yeah, no, just final thoughts on what Kiri said was, yeah, I think going back to the Tupac point is, and I think this is just kind of a general class analysis too, is like we want to, James Yaki Sayles talks about like we want to change the mentality of people to a revolutionary mentality. So like, the lumpen proletariat, the folks in prisons who are incarcerated, um, changing their criminal mentality into a revolutionary mentality into becoming politicized political prisoners or, it's like kind of like, where the revolution is like in terms of like in the core in the so-called United States, like revolution is within the prison. Um, but also outside the prison, within the, kind of the prison house of nations within the so-called United States, we have to change like this kind of consumerist, kind of grifter, influencer, labor aristocratic. There's all these names for it, capitalist mentality into a revolutionary mentality, and we definitely there's and the only way to do that is not only through like political education, obviously, but also through revolutionary art, like Curie said, um, and kind of a segue, I guess, into another artist that isn't doing music, but is doing art that is making art look irresistible, and I think does a great job of it. I do want to highlight them is Third World Solidarity Front, and what they do is basically they make prints, and their art is basically free for anyone to use and print and put up into the community, and they all have revolutionary slogans and whatnot in our poignant and punchy and, eye-catching. But also like they sell shirts. They sell shirts and with the print on it, you can buy it and all that money goes to um, the third world. It goes to organizations in the third world. It goes to folks in Venezuela, folks in other areas as well in Africa, um, to support kind of this kind of third world internationalism that is necessary. Like we have to be funneling the money to the third world because that's where revolution is, right? And Third World Solidarity Front is like a perfect example of that. And I think you know if folks aren't making music, but you make art in other ways, there's other methods to support, the movement. Um, and to give back to the community and give back to the third world in general is like important. Like could you imagine what it would look like if more artists were doing shows and doing print sales or doing art sales to support Cuba and like the solidarity work there, like, there was a lot more work to be done. And, I think artists kind of bear the brunt of that, um, that responsibility, right? Like you can't just make music without supporting the people that are suffering, in your community, but also internationally as well. And especially today with Cuba and especially with Venezuela, and especially what's going to be going on with Iran as well, with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Like we can't just sit idly. Um, so there's just my thoughts. I think hopefully this podcast, got people fired up and, interested in the criticisms we provided, of artists, but also provided, folks food for thought of like examples for like this is what revolutionary art looks like, this is what you can do, and this is like what is kind of the burden of what being an artist is, right? To support the people, support the masses, and support, the international revolutionary movement. So yeah, those are some of my closing thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to highlight really like clear examples on what people can be doing as artists. But yeah, I'll just kind of close us out for tonight. So, we talked about two Medium articles that Kiri and Geraldo wrote. Those will be linked in the show notes. The Revolution will not be streamed on Spotify. The role of music in Revolution and Counterrevolution, and Neocolonialism at Center Stage, Bad Bunny's Donroe, Propaganda Blitz. We also talked a lot about, historical co-option of music and art within the United States. We talked about more current examples like Bad Bunny, Beyonce, Kendrick Lamar. And then we talked about kind of some alternatives to the mainstream and kind of our analysis on the viable options and like what CLP feels like we can do right now in this current moment. And then we also talked, our final closing thoughts about revolutionary art and how to be a revolutionary artist. So I encourage everyone to check out all the artists that were mentioned. I'm sure everyone knows of Tupac, but also some of the other ones. And yeah, that pretty much concludes for the podcast. I think some things going on in CLP in the Bay Area. Hopefully, this podcast will be released very soon after we record it. We have a lot of stuff going on. We're starting the year off pretty strong as an organization. Considering all that's going on in the world, we need to continue the fight. So we have announced, I think our biggest announcement right now is our Youth Street Medic program in San Francisco. So we are starting a cohort this year, ages 16 to 23, and volunteers. That's open to all ages. So we have a form and we'll put it in the show notes if you want to sign up for that. It's a 20-hour program and mentorship from April to July. Some of it will be, some hybrid options, and then also in person. We, as always, have our, Oakland Chinatown grocery distribution every third Saturday of the month. Our Get Involved form will also be out there. We're also doing a lot of tabling events. If you go on our Instagram, I'm probably not going to name all of them, but we've been out and about and trying to get the word out there, trying to fundraise for our headquarters. That's a big thing. We have our Give Butter in the show notes as well. We're over halfway to our goal. So we're hoping to potentially be able to move into a space this year. And yeah, that's a lot of the stuff that's going on right now in CLP. And we also have our monthly skills days too. Next one's March 1st in San Francisco. But yeah, I wanted to thank everyone for listening. Thank you, Geraldo and Kiri, for these amazing articles. And I hope this podcast gives a good highlight and gets people to read them more and kind of analyze them a little bit. So feel free to leave a comment. You can leave comments on podcasts. It helps boost engagement. So please leave a comment if you like this or have comments about it. But yeah, follow us on Instagram at Community Liberation Programs, on Twitter at ComLib Programs, or see us out there in the Bay Area. Come volunteer, come to our reading groups. We'll be starting a new one up this year. But yeah, thanks everyone for listening.